Okay, thanks. I'm going to give you one of the questions we have here. This is, I believe, from Cameron, correct? Is this from you, buddy? Okay. Question. How do you go about identifying the truth languages of students you're talking to on campus? How do you personally, Mike, go about discerning which language is going to be most effective for them? Thanks, Cameron.
Yeah, that's a fair question. Well, I don't know that I actually do that. I mean, if it's like if I'm taking a girl out on a date, when I was dating. Now I've been married 30 years, so I'm not doing it now. But it's not like it was just trying different things to find out what her love language was. Typically, the people who will come to my lectures, they're interested in truth. And I'm lecturing. A lot of it's not one-on-one. I'm lecturing on these issues. And then a lot of times they will ask questions. They will come up and talk with me afterward. Those are typically the kind of people that have the truth language. They want evidence. So they naturally, will come to me. They'll be drawn to me because that's their language and they want to hear more. When that girl, the physician, I found out, her truth language wasn't necessarily evidence. It was more tradition. I just tried to plug her into a church where, recommended a few churches to her. Like there was a conservative Episcopalian church in Virginia Beach where I lived at the time. And, I could recommend her to go there, or, a few other churches that she could check out, were more of a high church environment. So, I don't know. There was a book that was put out a few years ago by Mark Mittelberg. It was an excellent book, and it was called Choosing Your Faith. And he talked about, he didn't call them truth languages, but it was basically the same kind of concept. And that book has been rewritten. Mark has updated it and published it under a different name now. And I'm not sure what that name is. But you can check out some of the books by Mark Mittelberg and see what Choosing Your Faith is now. That's an excellent book. And it's an excellent book to give to someone who's really open, because it does challenge them according to the truth language. It goes through the different truth languages. Again, it doesn't call them truth languages, but the different ways, I think there's 6 different ways in which people would choose their faith. And it goes through those and gives some encouragements and some warnings with each of them. So any person should be able to relate to it.
Okay. Next question. Other than using the Bible in your claims, again, what true historical evidence is there for the resurrection of Jesus Christ? So they're asking, outside of appealing to the word initially, the Bible, what historical claims are there for the resurrection of Jesus Christ?
Yeah, well, there's not much, of course, but that's like saying, well, outside of the Roman literature of that period, what evidence is there for Julius Caesar? It's the Romans who are going to write on these things because they're interested. It's the Christians who are going to write on these things because they're interested. The Christians weren't too interested in Roman matters, and the Romans weren't too interested in Christian matters. So you do have a few things. And I'm guessing when you say outside the Bible, you're not just talking about anything outside the Bible, because I could give you some early church fathers, some called the apostolic fathers, who actually knew the apostles. I could mention those, like Clement of Rome and Polycarp. Clement was a disciple of the Apostle Peter, while Polycarp was a disciple of the Apostle John. They mentioned the resurrection of Jesus and how the disciples were encouraged when Jesus had risen and had appeared to them. But my suspicion is that's not what you're looking for. You're looking for non-Christian sources that would mention the resurrection of Jesus. There's a possible mention by Josephus, who, in a disputed passage in Antiquities of the Jews, Book 18, Section 3, or Section 63, he mentions how there was Jesus, a Jewish itinerant speaker, who performed deeds that astonished crowds, that he had followers from the Jews and the Gentiles, and that Pilate, at the instigation of the Jewish leadership at that time, Pilate had him crucified, and that his disciples reported that he appeared alive to them, and the tribe of Christians remain to this day. Oh, it also mentions that Jesus, that he was the Messiah. But later on, Origen, an early church father, said that Josephus was not a Christian, so it's very doubtful that he's going to say Jesus was the Messiah. And there's a number of things that Josephus specialists will say Christians added to the text and doctored it later on, that Josephus didn't actually say all of that about Jesus. Now, most Josephus scholars do think that Josephus mentions Jesus there. They just don't think that he said he was the Messiah, or that he performed all these miracles, or that he rose from the dead. A number of scholars, including myself, would say that that they reported that he rose from the dead and appeared to them. I think that that just fits in the context, and for what we would know, Josephus would have known at that point, because he grew up in Jerusalem in the family of a popular Jewish priest at the very time the apostles would have been preaching Jesus was raised from the dead in Jerusalem. So there's no reason to think that Josephus would not have at least mentioned that he appeared alive to them. And since there were many messianic movements of that time, and when their Messiah figure was killed by the Romans, the movement fell apart. The Christian movement did not fall apart, and their belief in the resurrection would be the most plausible explanation for why it didn't fall apart, but why it thrived more than ever after Jesus was crucified. So that's a possible mention by a non-Christian source, but it wouldn't mention his resurrection. It would only mention that the disciples reported that he was alive. But here's the thing, I'd say, we wouldn't expect for a non-Christian to mention that Jesus was raised and still be a non-Christian. It's like, oh, Jesus was raised from the dead and I saw him, and by the way, I'm still not a Christian. I mean, we would think such a person was a moron, not a good source. And then further, I would say, even if we had such a source, we would think that that was certainly a text that had been doctored up by a Christian, because there's no way you'd have a non-Christian who would say, Jesus was raised, but I'm not going to be a Christian. I'm not going to do that. Now, what we do have, what I think our best source for the resurrection is Paul. Paul was not only a non-Christian, but he was out persecuting the church. He believed Jesus was a failed Messiah and a false prophet. And so Jesus would have been the very last person in the world that Paul would have expected to see or wanted to see. And so he's out persecuting the church, thinking it's God's will for him to destroy the movement Jesus had started. And all of a sudden, he has an experience that he believes is the risen Jesus appearing to him, and it radically transforms his life from being a persecutor of the church to one of its most able defenders, and to the point where he suffers lots of persecution, imprisonment, beatings, whippings, shipwreck, stoning, all kinds of stuff. And then in the end, he's beheaded outside of Rome for his gospel proclamation. So to have someone like that convert to Christianity based on what he thought was an appearance of the risen Jesus is really strong. And what's also great about Paul is we can establish historically that he was proclaiming the same gospel message as the Jerusalem apostles. So even if you were to throw out all four gospels, we could still get back to an outline of what Jesus' apostles were teaching and preaching based on the teachings of Paul, the gospel teachings of Paul. That doesn't mean that they were preaching everything he was preaching, but when it came to the gospel message, like we find in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, and as we find when it comes to the identity of who Jesus is, like in Romans and in Philippians and Colossians, well, we can be entirely confident that we can get back to numerous views of what the apostles of Jesus, those who had walked with Jesus, what they were proclaiming. So what we do have, historically speaking, is quite good. And even though a lot of people on the internet, the amateurs who are atheists out there, may focus on some more things like asking you for non-Christians who mention the resurrection of Jesus, the fact is that agnostic, atheist, and Jewish historians of Jesus recognize that we can gain a lot of knowledge about Jesus from the New Testament literature. They just look at it critically, such as what's early, what's eyewitness, what is multiply attested, what are embarrassing sources, those kinds of things.
Mike, how do you initiate evangelistic conversations and direct them to the historical Jesus discussion that makes the transition natural? How do you do this? You know, J. Warner Wallace has the whole, the way he intros almost everything is, what do you think happens to you when you die? Do you have kind of an answer or an intro or a transitional mode, or do you just let it organically happen by way of the conversation? I imagine you direct them to Jesus, which is what we're supposed to do. But again, how do you initiate the evangelistic conversation, and how do you direct them to the historical Jesus discussion and make the transition natural?
That's a great question. I think one of the best resources to help you out there would be the book co-authored by Bill Hybels, Mark Mittelberg, and Lee Strobel, Becoming a Contagious Christian. And that book talks about 6 ways in which our personalities may fit for the best or effective kind of evangelism for the kind of person we are as individuals. So there's the direct approach. When I worked at the North American Mission Board in the Atlanta area, I had a friend named Mark Lidecker, and he had a direct approach. He could walk up to someone and just say, hey, have you heard the gospel of Jesus Christ? And he could get away with that. He'd be the kind of guy that could go knock on a door and do it effectively. I can't do that. I mean, I can't do it. Of course, anyone can knock on a door, but for some reason, my personality isn't the type to do something effectively. And we all have different personalities and types. So for me, being a salesman, I was involved in sales for a while, and I was not good at it. I was an honest guy. I worked very hard. I tried to do what was best for the client, and I was a good technician. I just wasn't good at sales. I think we all have different personalities that fit different ways, and what Becoming a Contagious Christian does is help you to find the way that you are and to become effective using your personality and the kind of method that best fits your personality. It's a fantastic resource. I couldn't recommend it more highly for those of us who are involved in evangelism. That said, my own personal way of doing it is just a very laid-back way. I mean, a lot of my evangelism efforts is in front of groups on college campuses when I'm speaking to them and giving the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus and saying it's not only reasonable to believe, it's in our best interest to follow Jesus. So that's my way of doing it. For one-on-one, where that comes in most for me is when I'm on a plane and I'm sitting next to a person, and it's standard. Some people are real talkative when you're on the plane. I don't like this guy. I like to get on the plane and just relax because I really give of myself when I'm at an event, a conference. I'll have meals with people. I meet with them late into the night. I'm doing the lectures during the day, and when I'm finished, I just need to chill out. And it's nice to put on my noise-canceling headphones on the plane and listen to some soft music while I'm reading. So that's what I like to do. But I always open it up for an evangelism opportunity. And when I sit down next to the person or they sit down next to me, let's just say it's at the Atlanta airport, which is the one I fly out of. And they sit down and they're buckling in. I say, how you doing? Oh, I'm doing fine, thanks. How are you? Fine. Where are you headed today? Or is your last stop in Corpus Christi? No, I'm going on to such and such place or whatever. What are you doing there? And I strike up a conversation with them and ask them about themselves, and I let them talk about themselves for a while. And then after that, it's typical, it's good manners, good etiquette for the person to say in response, well, what are you doing in Corpus Christi? Well, I'm going down to speak at a conference. Oh, what kind of conference? Well, I'm going to be speaking on the historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus and why there are differences in the way the 4 Gospels in the New Testament report the same events. And, oh, well, that's kind of interesting. What do you do for a living? Well, I'm a professor of theology at Houston Baptist University. Well, at that point, sometimes they'll say, well, that's nice, and then they'll just go on their own way. They turn away, and that just lets me know they're not interested in talking. So it's like, well, I just, I threw out the bait. They didn't grab onto it, so it's just time to just go for a different fish, or I'm not going to go fishing anymore while I'm on the plane. So, and I just keep dangling the bait out there, and when they at some point stop taking the bait, well, then I stop fishing and I put my headphones on and I just read. But as long as they are grabbing at the bait, I just keep talking. So well, that's interesting. Why are you lecturing on the historical evidence for the resurrection? Is there really any evidence for it? Well, actually there is. And well, what kind of evidence? Well, here it is, and then I get in a conversation with them. So that's kind of how I do it. And for me, it's very low key. I remember there was this, I was flying back to Atlanta from Alaska several years ago, and we had a stop in, I think it was Seattle. And we got on the plane in Seattle, and we're starting to fly back, and I'm sitting next to this girl who was from China, but she lived in the Atlanta area and worked for a power company here. And we got talking, and she said, well, what do you do for a living? And I said, here's what I do. And she says, so is there really any historical evidence for Jesus's resurrection? And I said, yeah. And then something happened that just blew my mind. There was a guy who was a flight attendant, and he overheard the conversation. He said, oh, so we're going to hear the old gospel message preached? Oh, brother. And he said this with me sitting there. And the Chinese girl said, well, I certainly hope not, because I'm not interested in that at all. Well, what would you do in a situation like that? Well, I'll tell you what I did. I just looked at her and smiled and said, well, you asked. It's no sweat off my back. And I put on my headphones, and I opened my book and started reading. And she tapped on my leg, and I took the headphones off, and she said, actually, I would like to hear about it. And for the next 4.5 hours, 5 hours, the entire flight back to Atlanta, we talked about the resurrection and God and life issues. It was awesome. So that's kind of how I do evangelism. It's a low-key way, and it's the way that I found is effective for me in the kind of personality. And it's easy for me, and I've found that it's effective. It's a non-threatening way, but I kind of have that personality. It just kind of fits in that way. You've got to take your personality and find what fits for you. And so that's why I would recommend that book, Becoming a Contagious Christian. It's really awesome. In fact, you don't even have to get the book. I think there's a DVD series. So if you're not a reader, you can watch the DVDs and stuff like that.
Mike, isn't it true that a ministry like yours is almost completely useless for the average Christian or a worship leader? Or, I mean, this is really, have you had any sort of indication that a ministry like the one that you engage and the one that you do, your particular brand of evangelism and ministry, isn't it pointless for other branches of the church and ministry in Christianity?
Not at all. And that's why I applaud your church, because they hired you. And I mean, I can't think of, I mean, I'm not just saying this to tickle your ears, Joe, or build you up, but you're one of the finest guys out there I know. And I think they've just made a really, really wise choice in hiring you. You've got a passion for evangelism. You have a passion for apologetics. You love people. I hope those of you who are listening here today, you probably don't realize what a great resource you have with Joe Mulvihill. And if I were you guys, I'd just be plugging into him and learning as much from him as possible. I think it's very necessary to have this kind of stuff in the church. Now, again, because of truth languages, there are going to be people who do not relate to Christian apologetics. But we have to have Christian apologetics, if for nothing else, to minister to the youth in our church, to prepare them for college, because we're losing them. And we're losing them not because, we're losing them for a lot of reasons, but half of those reasons that we're losing our youth over when they go off to college can be addressed by Christian apologetics. Do we really want to tie and just, do we really want to write off half of those who are leaving the faith because we're unwilling to study this stuff? Now, that doesn't mean we need to become experts in this, and study it. It doesn't mean you need to get a PhD. It doesn't mean you even need to get a master's degree in this. But if you just become familiar with some basic resources, like Strobel's books. I mean, he's got 4 case for books out there. Just become familiar with those. Do some of this training that Joe is providing. And this should be able to equip you quite adequately to deal with the non-believers out there and to equip others in our churches. But we need to be doing this. This is too crucial a time to drop the ball on apologetics and to give it up because we're intimidated by it or whatever. The apostles used apologetics, only they used it a little differently. You had Peter and Paul, and they'd go throughout, as we read in the book of Acts, and they would give the gospel, and they'd say, but, we know this is true because Jesus is attested to us by miracles and his resurrection from the dead. And, hey, he rose from the dead and appeared to us. We're eyewitnesses of this. Well, we can't today say we're eyewitnesses, but they provided evidence for the truth of Christianity. They didn't just say, go back and read the Old Testament and believe our message on this stuff. They said, look, Jesus provided evidence. When John the Baptist was doubting, when he was in prison and he sent his disciples out to Jesus and they said, are you the one or are we to expect someone else? Jesus went back or told them to go back and tell John what they had seen and heard. The blind see, the deaf hear, the lame are now walking, the dead are raised, and the gospel is preached to the poor. So he provided evidence that he was who he was, but they were eyewitnesses of these kinds of things. We're not eyewitnesses, but what we do have is evidence. We have scientific evidence, we have philosophical evidence for God's existence, we have the scientific evidence for an intelligent designer of the universe and life itself, and we have historical evidence for the life, claims, death, and resurrection of Jesus. Why would we not want to use those in our present culture? So I do think we need to use these, and we do it to the church's own peril of its health if we don't use apologetics. Now, it doesn't mean every church has to have, let me just add this, Joe, I'm sorry. It doesn't mean that every church pastor has to, or youth pastor has to know this stuff really well, but at least delegate it to someone in your church who wants to minister, who really is passionate about apologetics and wants to have an apologetics ministry. Don't feel threatened by it. Some pastors feel threatened because they think people will think the apologist in the church is smarter than the pastor. Well, they might to some extent, but being a good pastor doesn't mean you're the smartest guy in the church. An apologist doesn't mean that they're going to know all the scriptures well. I can tell you this, that there are a lot of pastors with maybe not even a college degree who know the Old Testament better than I do. I have a PhD in New Testament studies, but that doesn't mean I know Old Testament well. And it doesn't mean I have a closer relationship to the Lord than the pastor. It doesn't mean that I walk more closely, that I know the Bible in its entirety better. It doesn't mean I'm a better Christian. So they don't need to be threatened by that, but they should, if they don't want to engage in apologetics themselves, and there's someone who's really passionate about it in the church, the pastor or youth pastor should be willing to delegate it to the person who's skilled in this area so that the church may be served.
Mike, we had a question.
And one more thing. Okay. No, I'm just teasing, Joe.
We had a question from one of the students, and I'd actually like this one. As friends, I don't know if we've had a chance to talk about this. The question is, you moved now to specialist in historical Jesus studies, but you used to be more of a generalist. You wrote a book on the many different reasons to believe in a higher power, all the way higher power to the specifics of Christianity. So you know, when you wrote the thing where behold, I stand at the door and knock. When you wrote that little pamphlet on what you do with Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses, that's not necessarily your ministry now, but you do debate a lot of different people and that have a lot of different worldview commitments. Which one of those commitments is the most difficult to engage right at this point or along your entire debate history?
I don't know that. Well, you know, the people I typically debate would be atheists, agnostics, and Muslims. I have yet to debate a Muslim or a Jewish scholar. Well, I'm sorry. Of course, I've debated Muslims. I've yet to debate a Buddhist or Hindu or Jewish scholars. I know some about those worldviews because I looked into them, especially Hinduism and Buddhism. But I haven't engaged in debates with them yet. I'd have to do some more preparation to have a debate with them. Between Muslims and atheist agnostics, I don't know that one is more difficult than the other. I would just say that you have to approach them differently. With atheists, I mean, they have different tactics than a Muslim does. A Muslim, you're not going to have to argue for God's existence. You're not going to have to argue for a supernatural dimension. So when I debated Matt Dillahunty in February, I took the first 10 minutes of my 25-minute opening statement and I provided 4 lines of evidence for a supernatural dimension. And by doing that, I show that, hey, atheism is not a rational worldview. We have too much evidence to show that there is a supernatural dimension, and even though that in itself does not prove Christianity, it may not in the most technical sense even prove the existence of God, but it does prove a supernatural dimension, and that is far more at home with Christianity than it is with atheism. And then I proceeded to give the historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. Now, with a Muslim, again, I don't have to argue for God's existence. I don't have to argue for the supernatural. But I'll take a different kind of view on that. You know, they're pretty much faith only with the Quran, and they'll try to give some sort of scientific confirmation of the Quran, bogus stuff usually. So you have to argue with a Muslim differently. And a Muslim is going to use, because they're with the Middle Eastern culture, they're going to be engaged in a lot more emotionally charged rhetoric. And so it depends on who my audience is. If I know that I'm going to have a lot of Muslims in the audience, I'm going to make an effort to match that rhetoric to an extent. So I'm going to be talking in more concrete terms when I'm speaking or debating a Muslim. I'm going to try to be honest, you know, I'm going to be honest, of course. But maybe with an atheist or an agnostic, I'm going to be more apt to say, hey, look, the evidence strongly suggests that Jesus rose from the dead. Whereas with a Muslim, I might say, hey, historically, we can show that Jesus rose from the dead. Now, they're both true, but when I'm speaking to an atheist or an agnostic, it's going to be a little more carefully nuanced. Whereas with the Muslim, it's going to be more of a, this is the fact, you know, we can show that Jesus rose from the dead by historical evidence. We can show that Jesus died by crucifixion. This is what Jesus claimed while he was on earth. He claimed to be divine, and this is in contradiction with the Quran. And the Quran is false in this way. And he said, whoa, you would actually say that the Quran is false and Muhammad was a false prophet during the debate? You bet I would. And I've learned this through former Muslims who are now Christians who have said, look, the problem, the mistake that Christians make in Western culture when debating Muslims is they're trying their best not to offend because of the politically correct subculture in Western society. And Middle Easterners do not, they don't relate to that. They think the PC culture is wimpy, and a Christian who is not willing to stand up for what they believe with conviction, they don't respect such a person. And I can tell you that my debates have been more effective when I took that kind of approach. Now, the Muslims, it's not to say that they smile and they like it. They don't. They get really stirred up. It's like hitting a hornet's nest. But they respect you, and they will listen to you at that point, whereas they lose respect for you if you really tone it down and try to make it so that you don't offend. So I wouldn't say one is different than the other, or I wouldn't say that one is more difficult than the other. They are different. I would say that debating a Muslim is more difficult for me because it's more in my nature to carefully nuance things. It's not so much in my nature to get out there and boom, and, you know, be so dogmatic about things. That's just not as much my personality. So I have to force myself a little bit to match the rhetoric. And so it's a little more difficult for me for debating a Muslim, but in terms of content, it's just different. It's not more difficult one way or the other.
Okay, we're drawing down the last 15 minutes here, so I'm going to try to give you these in succession so we can get everybody's questions in. Mike, sorry. Related to that last question, what is the most difficult question you face in evangelism? What's the most difficult question you face? And it could be because of the lack of clarity or the lack of time in the answer, but what do you find to be the most difficult in this particular style of evangelism?
Well, that's an easy one. It's the one I haven't heard before. And that's the kind of question, the kind of objection that comes out that none of us really like, because we haven't had time to prepare for it. We haven't had time to think through it. I remember years ago, I was on a radio dialogue with two atheists, and one of the atheists, the talk show host, said, well, when it comes to the resurrection, I mean, how do we know that they just didn't say resurrection to mean that his memory and teachings live on today? And at that point, I really hadn't studied the resurrection a whole lot, and I didn't know what to say. So the first thing that came to my mind was, well, it doesn't account for the empty tomb, which is really, you know, it's a true answer. Of course, you have to show that the tomb was empty, which I do think we have very good evidence for it. But if the tomb was empty, it's right. To say that it was a metaphor doesn't account for the empty tomb. But I got thinking about that afterward. I wish I'd had a more thorough answer. And so I just thought about it and thought about it and thought about it and read some commentaries and read some apologetics books. What do you do with this kind? How do I address these things? And then I came up with a more thorough answer. You know, things like, well, in 1 Corinthians 15, 20 and 23 says, Christ is the first fruits of those who sleep. In other words, he's the first to be raised in the general resurrection. Well, verse 23, when are the rest going to be raised? Well, when Christ returns. For Christ the first fruits, after that, those who belong to him at his coming. So we're going to be raised at his coming. And then it talks about that in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verses 13 through 17, where it says, the dead in Christ will be raised. Christ is going to bring back with him those who have died as Christians, and then the trumpet will blow and the dead in Christ will be raised. Well, wait a minute. If he's bringing back the spirits of Christians with him, then what does it mean when the dead are going to be raised after that? Well, it can only mean one thing, and that is that the corpses of the dead Christians and Jews of the past are going to be raised, and then their spirits will be reunited with those corpses. So it's a bodily resurrection. I'd also point out in Acts chapters 2, 10, and 13, especially 2 and 13, you have Peter and you have Paul preaching, and they cite Psalm 16:10, which for the resurrection, saying, you will not allow my Holy One to see decay. And then Paul, especially in chapter 13, says, you know, we think that this applied to David, but David died, was buried, and his body decayed. We know where it is today. Jesus died, was buried, but his body did not decay. God raised it up, and of that we are all eyewitnesses. So there, Paul could not have said in clearer terms that it was a bodily resurrection. And then I would go to the earliest critics of Christianity. What were they saying? Well, according to Matthew 28, the Jewish leadership were saying that the disciples had stolen the body. When you go to Celsus in the middle of the Justin Martyr in the middle of the 2nd century, they were saying that the gardener, they were also saying that the disciples had stolen the body. Then you go to Tertullian, and he said around the year 200, he says, well, they were saying, the skeptics were saying that the gardener reburied the body. Celsus, toward the end of the 2nd century, was saying that Jesus faked his death and then appeared alive. So what are all these criticisms doing? They are not denying the resurrection. They're accounting for an empty tomb. They are accounting for or countering the claim that Jesus had been raised bodily from the dead. Well, here's why he was seen bodily afterward. And notice that the Christians, what did they respond? They didn't say, oh, well, you don't understand what we're saying. We don't really mean to say that Jesus' resurrection is merely a metaphor. They weren't saying, we meant to say that Jesus' resurrection was just a metaphor to say his teachings alive, he's alive today, exalted in heaven, but not that he's here on earth or that his memory and teachings live on today. That's not what they were saying. They reaffirmed the bodily resurrection of Jesus. So anyway, that's how I have come to have a more thorough answer over the years by studying this more. So the most difficult question is the one that you haven't been asked yet. If you've been asked and you've had time to research it, then there aren't any really difficult ones. It's the one you're unprepared to answer.
This is a typical question, Mike, and I don't know what you want to do with it. We're going to go over it a lot more next year when we start our New Testament section. One of the students asked, could you give a quick summary of how you'd move in justifying the resurrection? I don't know if this is going to be something with minimal facts or anyway.
Yeah, I just want to say you can go on my website, risenjesus.com, and I have several debates and lectures there. There are different approaches. It depends on the person. If this person's sophisticated and well-read, well, then I'm going to go into a more sophisticated argument. But if I'm trying to keep it in a nutshell, I might say, hey, well, there are a certain number of facts that even skeptical scholars who have studied this issue, the majority of them, nearly a universal consensus of even skeptical scholars who study this issue, are willing to grant, such as subsequent to Jesus' his death, a number of his followers, his disciples, had experiences that convinced them Jesus had been raised and had appeared to them, and that these experiences occurred in both individual and in group settings. And then I would also add that there was a skeptic, a persecutor of the church named Paul, who also had an experience that he was convinced was an appearance of the risen Jesus. So these are facts that are granted by virtually 100% of even skeptical scholars who studied the subject. The question is, what do we do with these facts now? And so you come up with major hypotheses that attempt to account for these, and the hypothesis that best accounts for these facts is regarded by historians as what probably occurred. And then I just will go through and say, let's look at the hallucination hypothesis. That does not account for the group appearances, because we know that group hallucinations are extremely rare, if not impossible, because hallucinations are experiences that go on in the mind of an individual. They're like dreams. They have no external reality, and you can't share it with someone else. In other words, my wife and I might both be dreaming we're in Hawaii, but we're not having the same dream, and we're not interacting with one another in the same dream, between the dreams. So hallucinations are the same way. So you've got multiple group appearances that are reported in the earliest accounts that can be traced back to the disciples. So you could either say they're lying or whatever, but you couldn't say they're hallucinating, because group hallucinations, again, they're not possible. It doesn't account for the volume of hallucinations or the percentage of them. So, for example, only 7% of senior adults bereaving the loss of a loved one experience a visual hallucination, and that's the highest percentage group, the ones most likely to experience a hallucination. So that wouldn't account for the 100% of the disciples who claim to have seen the risen Jesus. So you have 100% rather than 7%. You have at least 3 group appearances, and then you've got the appearance to Paul. Paul was not grieving over Jesus' death. Again, he was glad Jesus was died, and Jesus would have been the last person Paul would have expected or wanted to see. So the hallucination hypothesis doesn't account for the facts well at all. The resurrection hypothesis does. And that's why, historically speaking, it's a superior hypothesis. Now, if I'm dealing with someone who is maybe, I suspect, may not be as sophisticated or as educated of a person, I'll go with a simpler argument. I'll say, look, let's just go with one fact here. Shortly after Jesus' death, a number of his followers had experiences they believed was the risen Jesus. Or, no, I'm sorry, we won't even say they believed it. They were just claiming. Every scholar will admit they were claiming that Jesus was raised and appeared to them. So either Jesus appeared to them or he did not appear to them. It's that simple. There's no other option. Well, if he did not appear to them, there's only two options. They either thought he did or they didn't think that he did. Well, if they thought he did, it was a hallucination, and then I refute that. If they did not think that he did, so they were claiming he appeared to them, he didn't, and they knew that he didn't, well, then they were lying, and then I address that. The other option over here is that he appeared to they claimed that he appeared to them, and he did appear to them. Either he did not die and he survived the crucifixion, or he died. So then I show that the apparent death theory doesn't work, and that only leaves us with one option, the resurrection. So that's my little logic tree for that, and it's a pretty simple one that if I'm talking to a waitress in a restaurant, I can draw it out for her on a napkin in a restaurant. It's pretty simple. So it depends on the person. But those are the two basic approaches that I take in a nutshell.
Excellent. We'll be doing that next year, actually testing and committing that to memory a little bit more when we do our New Testament section. Mike, what about making, I think you've done a masterful job so far of doing this. I love your laid-back style. Not making apologetics so academic. How could you make it a little more accessible? You just gave us the simple version versus the more complex or sophisticated version for just a layperson. Do you have any suggestions for making apologetics a little more interactive or engaging? You seem to be really good at this.
Well, I was talking to Frank Turk on the phone yesterday. You know, you're friends with Frank, I'm sure. And he said, yeah, let's make the resurrection great again. And so that's what we want to do, making the resurrection great again, through our lectures and so forth. Well, when I give lectures, I invite Q&A. I love the Q&A. It's the time to interact with folks. So I try in most of my lectures, I always ask that we reserve some time to allow for audience Q&A. And at the very beginning, I say to them, okay, let's take some questions. And look, and I just say right from the beginning of the Q&A, I said, look, I don't know everything. I've studied this quite a bit, but there are some things that I don't have the answers to. I acknowledge that. I acknowledge that there's still some tensions, things that I wrestle with. And maybe you're going to mention some of those, and I'm fine. I'm happy to say I don't have the answers to those. And you know what? I can be wrong on some things. So I want you to feel free to push back on anything that I have said this evening. And, I'll try to give an answer of what I think is a reasonable response. If I don't have an answer, I'll admit it. What I do promise is that I will not embarrass you. So I'd like to just have a good conversation. So I want to welcome some questions. Please step up to the mic and let's go. So that's kind of how I do.
Excellent.
And during the debates, I always try to, Gary Habermas taught me about this. He was doing it, and I figured I'd try it, and I love doing it. I always ask to have dinner with my debate opponent before the debate. And we just have a good time. We share a little about one another and what got us into what we're doing. And, I might even say some things that make me vulnerable. Like, hey, there have been some time today, I still struggle with the concept of hell. It troubles me, and they see if I'm willing to make myself vulnerable, they will sometimes as well. And so we get along pretty well at that dinner before the debate. And so we go into the debate, and now we're kind of friends. And so our debates have never gotten heated. I've never been involved in a heated debate, public debate, that is. I've been involved in some spirited debates, but we didn't have some bad feelings toward one another afterward. I want the guy to know that I care for him. that I respect him and that I care for my opponent. I want them to know that. And I've even told some of my opponents, hey, look, if you're ever in the Atlanta area and you need a place to stay, come on. My house is open to you. So I try to be friends with them. And and even after the debate, I don't write stuff online where I malign my opponent. I might still criticize their arguments, but I don't put them down, and I don't treat them in a disrespectful way. In fact, it is rare when I will even offer comments on a debate after the debate online. I might share it with some friends like Joe or Bill Craig or Gary Habermas or some others if they ask me about it, but I'm not going to be publicly out there talking about the debate because I don't want my opponent to see that I'm trashing him or bad-mouthing him in any way. And I think they respect me because of that.
Yeah. Mike, one last question as we finish up here. What do you have coming up that you can tell us very briefly what's coming up? And we want to pray with you. We're for you, we're with you, and we want to pray with you as we close here. So you just tell us real quick what you have coming up, and we can include that in the prayer as we pray together for you. Would you tell us?
Well, yeah, of course, I always have speaking engagements, and they're fun. And I'll be in Corpus Christi this weekend. But my spring was really busy with travel, as springs usually are. Mm-hmm. And then travel gets soft for the summer and then picks up a little bit in the fall. So my big events, as far as I know for the year, the debates are over unless, one gets scheduled for the fall. I would guess my biggest prayer request right now regarding ministry would simply be with this new book on gospel differences that came out. I really think that this has the potential. It's some groundbreaking stuff, and it's been endorsed by some top-notch scholars. And in fact, J.I. Packer, who is a very conservative Christian theologian, sent me an unsolicited endorsement for it a couple of months ago, and that was pretty cool. So, but it's getting some really good, endorsements, some comments from some leading scholars. I think that it has the potential to destroy the objection to the reliability of the Gospels based on contradictions. I think it has the ability to destroy that. So I guess it's not so much for me as it would be to pray that God would use that book for the benefit of his kingdom.
Absolutely.
I guess for me, you could just pray. All of us are out there. Joe, you're a leader. I'm a leader out there. The people in those seats, many of them are going to be leaders. And the evil one is against us, and the evil one will do what he can to trip us up. So I guess for myself, to pray that I will always stay faithful to the Lord and not get tripped up by the schemes of the evil one.
Amen.
And I don't say that lightly. I know that they're out there. So things that try to trip me up, so that I will just stay, walking with the Lord holy before him.
Yes, let's bow, pray for our brother. Gracious God, you are good. You don't owe us a thing. I want to thank you for the work of my brother Mike and the work you've been able to take, the loaves and multiply them, God. Unbelievable ministry, God. We ask you to protect him, give him wisdom when it comes to fighting his own nature, fighting the enemy of our soul, the evil one, even, Lord, wrestling with you, that you would bring him out a more mature and conscientious Christian with any struggle that comes, God. And if these books are as powerful as his other books, God, especially this current one, on the inspired word you've left us, we ask you to protect him and give him strategies to make it through the attacks and make it through the issues and come out a better Christian and a stronger one on the other side. And Lord, we ask you to take his work as you've already done and put it in the hands of people that can remove obstacles to see you, see Jesus clearly. We praise you and thank you, the lover of our souls, and pray all these things in the strong and powerful name of Jesus. Amen. Thank you, Mike. Thank you. We love you, man. Thank you, brother.
Yeah, I love you guys too.
I'll
Thank
call
you, Joe. Appreciate it.
I'll call you. All right. See ya.